Hi, all. This is Charlie Swenson in the podcast called To Hell and Back. The podcast has basically been on pause since the spring of 2024 as I dealt with a lot of personal matters and just overcommitments. And now, in the wake of the first 90 days of the Trump administration and the chaos that it has created, and the difficulties and the suffering that it is obviously going to continue to create, um, I'm returning to the podcast and I want to focus on that issue for a while. Let me tell you, some of you wouldn't know who I am. I'm hoping this will get out to more people than just people who've seen my podcast before. If you haven't seen my podcast before, there are about 115 one-hour podcasts that I've done that are on my website, charlieswenson.com, that have to do with uh, getting into hell of different varieties and getting out of hell, getting through hell, getting out of hell. The hell of uh, of terminal illness, the hell of diagnosis, the hell of losing a family member to suicide, the hell of losing a child, uh, the hell of being in a hurricane and having your life totally turned upside down, and many other types of hell, the hell of substance use and addictions. And some of the hell of the first Trump administration, talking at that point of some of the difficulties then. Um, a little more about myself. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a psychotherapist. I work in Northampton, Massachusetts. That's where I'm sitting right now. Um, the first years of my career were spent in as a psychiatrist and a family therapist, but also a psychoanalyst in psychoanalytic training and then psychoanalytic psychotherapy, especially focused on people with borderline personality disorder and narcissistic disorders, some antisocial disorders. Uh, and then a discovery during the second half of the 1980s of Marsha Linehan's work before it was actually out public anywhere. And I went and learned about it. I studied it. I implemented it alongside my psychoanalytic work. And then it kind of became a whole world in itself. And since about 1990, that's been the main theme of my work, has been dialectical behavior therapy, applying it in lots of settings, writing about it, consulting, supervising, using it in my own private practice, etc. And it forms the backbone of the um, podcast, though not the entirety of it, but principles, skills, strategies that come from DBT seem to apply to lots of situations to help people not just with borderline personality disorder and suicide, but with lots of adversity and suffering in life. So, why DBT in this situation? DBT is not a political framework. It is not a theory of functioning in the government. It's not a historical study. Uh, so what does it have to offer? What it has to offer is that the main focus of DBT is how to build a life effectively and with compassion, uh, helping with behavior that's become out of control or dysregulated or over-controlled, helping with the suffering that's inside when people do those things, like self-harm, suicide, substance use, eating disorders, PTSD. So it's kind of has to do with the whole human being, internal suffering, and then external behaviors that are manifestations of unregulated suffering. And I thought at first, what does that have to do with trying to figure out how I want to position myself in relation to the takeover of our country by someone who clearly has dictatorial aspirations and is willing to violate the rules in all domains in order to assert and gain and perpetuate his power and control and authority with little regard for the suffering that it's causing other people. That's what's going on. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not sure DBT has much to offer this other than my own practices within DBT, such as mindfulness practices, but also my skills to regulate my own emotions in this context. And I am going to want to get back to all of that over the next two or three podcasts to give ideas because I think maybe there are ways this can help other people get through this period and be effective and compassionate in this period and take care of yourself. But for right now, there were certain things about DBT as a system that I think help me to clarify myself in relation to what's going on and help me to move towards a more activist posture instead of one that's kind of overwhelmed, confused, and paralyzed. So let me try to tell you about that. First, what is the nature of this hell? I've already kind of said what it is. We're used to living in a system for a very long time, the United States of America, that goes by certain guiding principles and certain practices and certain routines and certain laws, regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're always in question and they're always to be reviewed. But what has happened now in the last 90 days, and having been prepared in advance to do it fast, was a sort of a move towards tyranny regarding nearly every system that the government oversees, which is most of our country in many ways. So this takeover, whether we're talking about the devastation being caused by the unilateral imposition of tariffs on the whole world, including our allies, and including countries where it doesn't make any sense. The attack on rules, the rule of law, the due process that people should be entitled to if they're accused of something, the deportations that are going on that have both illegal and inhumane qualities to them, and we all know about those. The attacks on the education system, public education, and now attacks on universities such as Harvard, Columbia, and many others. The attack on our healthcare systems, the dismantling of so many of these things. Even in the last 24 hours, me learning about the decision to end Head Start programs for young children that are in deprived situations. The attack on the U.S. aid program, the decision to end AmeriCorps, just volunteer programs of young people going and helping communities. These kind of gratuitous, unnecessary extensions of power and the attempt to dictate things about gender and the obvious perpetuation of racism. All of these things, when you add them all up, they create a certain kind of hell that isn't embedded in any one of them. It's all of them hitting day after day at such a dizzying pace that one can hardly keep up. And whether you're somebody who's dysregulated by these things on a daily basis and really have trouble functioning, or you're somebody who continues to do your functioning of your life, but in the background, this is a constant. It's kind of like continuing to do your job day by day, but hearing the buzzing of trouble and chaos and mistreatment going on two steps removed from you, and then maybe one step removed from you. It's just affecting everybody, not only in the United States, but really across the world. For not very good, obvious reasons. The reasons put forth don't seem to match, actually, some kind of valid understanding of what's going on and how to repair it. It just seems to be a demonstration of power, money, greed, racism, uh, an attempt at establishing dictatorship and tyranny and trying to get Congress to bow to the dictator, get the courts to bow to the dictator, get people to just not do very much and just let the dictator take over. So all of this is going on. This is sort of some of the characteristics from my perspective of the hell that's going on. Obviously, some of you might have a very different perspective than me. I'm not a historian, a politician, an expert on government. So I don't claim to be another sort of commentator of the kind that are out there trying to make sense of all of this with their own backgrounds. I'm looking at it as a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, a DBT expert, because I'm interested in suffering and effective functioning. So those are my perspectives, and clearly I have some political leaning in a direction that makes me feel like these attacks on all of these institutions and practices and guidelines and rules and law, and not to having mentioned the media, and including public media that many people rely on. It's just sort of that's my perspective, that creates a certain version of hell that's chaos and constant intrusions of information. Nearly every day, there's another takeover attempt, and now pushbacks. There have been, even now, within 90 days of the beginning of his presidency, there have been more than 80 court injunctions against what he's doing, and it continues to go on. So that's the nature of the hell I'm talking about. It doesn't fully characterize it, and it's different for every person, but that's the idea. So here's when I was thinking about DBT's application to it. There's a concept within DBT, which those of you who are DBT people know, other people might not know, but it's easy to explain. There are these, when you're treating somebody with severe emotional problems and problematic behaviors that are ruining their life or the lives of others, and you try to tackle the problems, and you're doing that in therapy or some sort of treatment program, you run into some patterns that get in the way and that perpetuate the problem, and they become the focus of your treatment. And those patterns come in twos, in dialectical opposition to each other at the opposite ends of, let's say, polarities. So, for instance, a lot of people with borderline personality disorder, on the one hand, find themselves suffering with very heightened emotional vulnerability. They have thin skin, they're easily devastated, anxious, depressed, have all kinds of memories of the past that don't go very well. And therefore, we call that emotional vulnerability. And emotional vulnerability can, if it gets bad enough, be a reason for suicide. It's certainly a reason for other things too, to alleviate pain, such as substance use and other kinds of addictions and eating disorders and other things, other problematic behaviors, including violence. So there's emotional vulnerability, right? That's a pattern that once you encounter it in somebody, that becomes a focus of treatment. If you're going to treat somebody's attempt to suicide, you have to treat the thing that's driving it. So what might be driving it might be emotional vulnerability that came from birth, that came from early childhood, it came from mistreatment, it came from deprivation, it came from trauma. All kinds of things lead to this sort of concoction of emotional vulnerability, right? But at the other end of that polarity, because I'm saying there's a dialectical dilemma, and dialectical means two opposing poles or forces. So what's the other side of this? Is called self-invalidation. So you're upset about something, You feel that you're responding so sensitively. Somebody doesn't return a phone call to you, and you feel like the relationship is over, and your friendships are over, and somebody doesn't like you, and somebody hates you, and you feel thin skin, and you're in a lot of pain. And what happens next is you flip over to the other side of this polarity, which is self-invalidation, and you start criticizing yourself. Oh, I'm so sensitive. Oh, there's something so wrong with me. Why do I respond this way and other people don't? So there is a heightened sense of self-criticism, which can progress further when it's more extreme to self-hatred, self-loathing, a sense of not deserving a life. And it is another avenue through which somebody could be driven towards suicide and these other problem behaviors. You feel so bad about yourself that you go use substances and kind of obliterate the awareness. So this bounce back and forth, and you're having a lot of self-judgment, self-hatred, self-loathing, self-disgust, and then you flip over to being heightened sensitivity, heightened vulnerability, maybe heightened shame as part of the self-criticism, and these things go back and forth. So we call that a dialectical dilemma because when you're trying to treat somebody and somebody's flipping back and forth between this level of vulnerability and this level of self-hatred, you want to help them move to the middle of that. You want to help them move to something that works. You can't like get them to not be sensitive, get them to not be vulnerable. And maybe you might not even be able to get them to not be self-critical. But you want to move self-criticism towards something that's more functional and more understood and more acceptable and doesn't progress along a pathway to self-loathing, self-hatred, self-disgust, and death. So you just want to have help somebody learn the capacity to be self-critical and hold there, learn from it, manage it, process it, deal with it, maybe communicate it to somebody who's a trustworthy person. And on the other hand, you want to help somebody be able to manage the slings and arrows of life with sensitivities that are activated, how to manage those sensitivities, how to manage those emotions so that you don't end up going down that extreme pathway of severe emotional vulnerability and then on to I can't stand this anymore and needing to kill yourself. So you're working to bring these things that go too far out on the two sides of the polarities. I hope I'm making this clear because I don't want to draw a diagram because many of you might just be listening to this, not looking at it. So, you have these sort of bidirectional arrow, and at one end of the arrow is self-invalidation. The other end of the arrow is emotional vulnerability. And you want to keep people closer to the middle of that arrow where actually they can deal with self-criticism more functionally and they can deal with emotional vulnerability more functionally. And that's where DBT's skills and strategies come in to help in therapy, help people move towards this capacity to live closer to the middle. All right, inside the circle, so to speak, is how I think of it. All right, so that's the concept. How does that concept map onto what's going on? I think and by the way, that what I just laid out to you was one dialectical dilemma of several in DBT. And it's a useful organizing concept in treatment that's used more than just with emotional vulnerability and self-invalidation. So now how do you use it in this particular version of hell? Well, I'm going from my own experience as well as people that I know. There's a dialectical dilemma that goes on for many of us in the face of this kind of tyrannical overreach. And here's how it works. On the one hand, there's a tendency towards feeling immersed in a dizzying array of information, sometimes changed day by day, the way the tariffs were changed over and over again, to the point where there's confusion, there's uncertainty. It's hard to keep track of things. And then you hear another thing and then another thing. And just when you're trying to get your mind clear about what's going on with the battles between the Trump administration and the court system and the Supreme Court, Then you hear more about the tariffs and how those are being adjusted and changed and how they're affecting the economy and the stock market and the relationship to other countries. And then you hear about pulling out of some international organization. And then you hear about the embrace of dictatorships around the world, but the weakening of alliances with democratic countries. And then you hear about the attack on universities such as Columbia or Harvard and in general, all universities and private education. And you just hear about one thing after another, and doesn't it just add up? And it's sort of like it's just immersing and it's confusing and it makes you sad about what's getting lost in the shuffle and angry about what's being done to your country and to your life and to people that you care about and people you don't even know but you care about, that all of this is going on. It's just overwhelming. It's an overwhelming set of triggers for emotions that get going in us. And then we're living inside this bubble of immersed in this bubble of emotionality and responses and thoughts about what's going on, that make us actually more emotionally vulnerable and can make us critical and self-critical. But that wasn't the main point. I just want to say, at one pole, we're immersed, we're intruded upon, we're overwhelmed, we have a lot of emotions about what's going on, and it's really hard to make sense of it all and figure out what am I going to do. And at the other pole, we flip then over to the other side, which is the side of retreating from what's going on, trying to get away from the chaos, trying to not think about it, trying to immerse ourselves in our daily lives and in what we usually do and in what we have and what's going on with our latest Netflix saga and what we're doing in our jobs. And we pull ourselves into that, and let's call that a position of retreat, which then becomes kind of like it causes us to have, in relation to the chaos that's going on, to end up in a rather passive stance, a kind of paralyzed position. And I have experienced all of this in the past 90 days. I just felt I should be doing something, but I also felt like I don't want to be immersed in the chaos. And so it's kind of like bouncing back and forth between being overwhelmed and immersed. And then on the other hand, retreating and being isolated and not being effective at handling what's going on. So once I started to think of that, yeah, then actually what we want to find is to move ourselves towards the middle. So generally, this is not going to be a podcast today with lots of specific solutions, but generally the solutions flow for me from thinking that rather than being paralyzed and passive and laying down and hoping for the best, that I should be jumping in and doing something within my capacities and what I can do and take a stance if I believe something's going wrong. But on the other hand, I need retreats. I need self-care. I need restoration. I need to get away from the chaos and away from the overwhelmedness to preserve myself so I can think, I can sleep, I can keep up the things that are my anchor points in my life, right? So you want to move out of the extreme position towards the middle and be more functionally managing the overwhelm by finding your own way to retreat here and there in whatever way, and it'd be different for every person. And then there's dealing with the other pole, being immersed all the time, that you want to find where in that immersion, where in that chaos, where in that huge, overwhelming, multi-domain attack on normalcy of life in America. You want to find the chunks of where you can do something, but it doesn't overwhelm you. So you can go to a protest, or you could write letters, or you could send money, or you could speak out at certain key moments, or you could go do some sort of contributions towards people that are directly in line of the tyrannical overreach, like like working with people who are possibly going to be deported. There's a program around here and probably across the country, I think sponsored by the ACLU, to find volunteers that'll help, for instance, with helping parents who might end up getting deported be coping ahead and anticipating what to do about their children if that were to happen. And so having meetings about that, that's just one of 8,000 things you can do. But find a chunk because it helps to take on something, whether large or small, and become active. It helps your own mood regulation. It helps you feel like, okay, there's a contribution. In a larger sense, for those who look at the whole movement of how to stop this tyrannical overreach, I think, it then creates yet another person who's doing another thing, which joins into everybody else doing everything that's going on, which hopefully, as it mounts in intensity and breadth, will become an increasingly loud voice and a pushback. Um, so that's my first big idea from DBT that sort of helps me organize my thinking of what I want to be doing, is to realize that I'm caught between two poles of a dialectical dilemma, and I'm looking for a functional way to be closer to the middle. Okay. Next point I want to make is a more practical one. One way I got to that, one way I started to think more clearly and using DBT, since that is something I know a lot about, as a lens through which to look at things, was that when this all got going in the last few weeks, and I realized, in addition to the normal stresses and strains in my life that I'm attending to and the commitments I've made, um, it's overwhelming. I decided I needed to ramp up my use of mindfulness practices so that I started to get up an extra, just to be practical about it, a half hour earlier than usual at 6 in the morning instead of 6:30. And then I get up, my dog gets up with me. I'm in charge of her in the morning. Her name is Lola. She's a little, she's partly border collie and partly a lab, has a good temperament, and she's always busy. And so I put her outside to do her business, and then she comes back in. But then I just sit in a place on a couch, actually, and sit upright and sit quietly for half an hour. And she comes and sits next to me, thank God, rather than harass me or anything for food, because she's willing to wait once she's been able to go out. So I sit there, and then I try to reconnect with myself because I think one of the problems of this intrusive, overwhelming, chaotic environment is that it can disrupt your connection with yourself, your own usual practices, your own sense of being in touch with your mind and your body. And so I just try to get back to basics. And so what I do practically is for about 5 or 10 minutes, I just sit there and notice what's going on in my mind, which is usually my mind is jumping all over the place. It's kind of, which is sort of like me my whole life, but it's a little more than usual. And the jumping around includes the jumping around with all kinds of information that I'm getting about what's going on in the country that's disturbing to me, even if it isn't yet at my doorstep. And so my mind is jumping around. And so I just begin to notice and define my relationship to my own internal chaos. And it's as if I'm sitting at the edge of my own chaos and just noticing it. It's as if I'm imagining that there's a transparent sphere in front of me that's that's just big enough to hold a lot of the chaos in it, but it makes it possible to see it as something right there in front of me, but not overwhelming me from the outside in, if you know what I mean. It's just sort of like, okay, gradually it settles a little bit. It takes a little shape. And then I start saying to myself certain things that I've learned through meditation practices, where when you're breathing in and breathing out, you're just noticing entirely your breath. So the ones I do, which are very typical and not special to me, and they're special to me, but they aren't created by me, is I start saying to myself, while breathing in, I just say, I'm breathing in. And then while breathing out, I just say, I am breathing out. And I do that for a while. Maybe I do that for 3 or 4 minutes. Breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. And there's this, just even though that sounds to those who haven't done this kind of like simplistic and as if it might not do very much, it actually does a lot for me. It sort of helps me consolidate my attention and my being around just the fact that my breath is, in fact, at this moment, truly in reality going in and out. And that's what's going on. And I anchor myself in that process of just noticing my breath going in and out and saying that to myself. And then I sometimes move on to saying other things to myself about my breath. Like one of them is just breathing in, I say to myself, calming. So I imagine that while I'm breathing in, I'm just calming my entire self, my body, my mind, my soul. I'm just calming as if there's some fluid that's coming through me by virtue of breathing in that just goes throughout my body and just tries to calm it down, right? So I breathing in, I say to myself, calming. And breathing out, I say to myself, releasing. And what I'm hoping to be releasing, it's kind of a reverse process from the calming, is release tension. It's like bring in calm and let go tension, whether it's physical tension, whether it's thought tension, whether it's conflict in my mind, let go. The reality at this moment is I'm just sitting here quietly next to my dog. I can just let those things go and bring my mind back to just calming and back to the fact that I'm just breathing in and I'm breathing out. It's taken me many years to realize how brilliant it is to just focus on breathing. It just, it's always there. It's solid. It changes all the time. Sometimes when I focus on my breathing, I just notice, God, my breathing is like going at a rapid pace today. And I don't try to change it. I just know there it is. I'm breathing fast today. Other times, my suddenly, in the middle of 20 minutes into doing what I'm doing, my breathing is slows down. And I take, yeah, sometimes that gets ushered in by one big, deep breath in or out, as if I'm sighing and letting go the tension and bringing in the calm. And there are other things I do sometimes when I'm breathing. I count my breath and things like that that are standard practices. Whatever it is, it doesn't have to be what I'm doing. But I just found that when I started to do that at the beginning of my morning and before my wife gets up and before I'm making breakfast and making the food for the dog and getting ready for the day, it just starts with that. And it was during those things that I started to just feel like, okay, excuse me. Okay, I am now establishing an anchor point. I'm establishing myself on a stable platform with my breathing. And from that position where I'm more grounded, I can now entertain what is going on in the world and how is what's going on in the world getting into my psychological self, what's going on in my mind. And it just sort of like made it possible to more calmly, with less chaos and less overwhelmedness, just experience what's going on, as if all of that's happening inside that sphere that I mentioned, while I'm sitting here behind it, next to it, looking at it, but distant from it. And once I started to do that, that sphere starts to sort out between these dialectical dilemma, for instance, came to my mind while I was doing that. I started realizing, oh yeah, there's me being intruded upon, being overwhelmed, being confused, being troubled by what's going on. And then there's me just laying down and trying to get out of it and thinking, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I just wish life could go on without all of this going on, even though it's still going on. So I kind of see this pole move back and forth. And then I start thinking, oh, okay, thinking of DBT, I feel like I need to learn to move towards the middle. So that helped. Now, there's another thing that came up that's my next main point I want to make in this podcast. It's another sort of overarching teaching way of thinking within DBT that I'm finding very helpful in determining how to respond to what's going on around me, what to respond to, how to respond to it. And it's this. There's a phrase within the DBT world, and I'll explain it, but it's you validate the valid and you invalidate the invalid. And let me tell you where that comes psychologically and then how that might apply to the global situation we're dealing with. Like, here's an example. Many years ago, actually, when I was still in New York, so it's like more than 30 years ago, I had a young patient who had schizophrenia. And we were very engaged in working together. He had a very interesting mind, and but it was a mind that was often driven by psychotic delusions. And one day we're sitting in a session and he seems very agitated. I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, I think the building's going to blow up and we should probably get out of here before it blows up." I said, "What makes you think the building's going to blow up?" "I can just feel it. It's just like there's a lot of pressure building up in this building. And maybe you don't feel it, but I think we should get out of here. It really seems like it could become dangerous." And I felt his pressure, and of course, I thought maybe he's right, but I also knew that he had a tendency to have delusions, and that he probably isn't right. He's probably not going to blow up. I don't see anything different, but I don't want to totally rule out that possibility. Maybe he's the one person noticing this, but mainly I thought it's some kind of delusion. What is going on here? And I forget how I inquired, but we had a conversation about his sense that it could blow up. And there's something occurred to me in the middle of the conversation that led me to ask him, um, is there something in your body building up that creating a lot of pressure in you? And he says, "I don't know what you're talking about. The building's going to blow up." And then I thought more specifically, and I thought, is it possible you have to go to the bathroom? And he said, "Actually, yes, I really have to pee. And it's really hard not to do it." I said, "So why don't you get up and go to the bathroom? I'll just wait here." He says, "Really? I can do that? It's okay?" I said, "Absolutely. Of course that's okay. Why don't you go take care of that and just come back? I'll be waiting for you." He went, he came back, he sat down, the pressure was gone. No more talk about the building. Now, what's the point of this? There was something that was valid and there was something that was invalid. What was valid was that he had pressure building up in his bladder, and he was worried about that. It's valid that he was concerned that maybe he wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom. Somehow he had thought that. Somehow he learned that in his life. All of that's sort of valid going on, and that's creating the problem. And there's a solution to what's valid. You can also validate what's valid. When he told me, I said, "Oh my God, of course you've got to get up and go." And he felt validated, and then he got up and go. Then there's something invalid, which is that because of the way his mind worked in a psychotic fashion, he had the idea the building would blow up. That's invalid. That is not a match with reality. That's not the truth. That's not a fact. But it is a fact in his own mind. So there was the valid and the invalid. And if you try to solve the invalid, it's going to be hard to solve it. We could leave the building, but that actually wouldn't solve the problem. He would still have to pee somewhere. So finding what's valid at the core of what appears invalid is an important process in psychotherapy and in your life. Something's wrong. You want to get to the core of it, get to the root of it. And the root of it was that his bladder was under pressure. And then it got elaborated in an invalid way. Second example, that's more of an emotional related one and not a physically related one. A teenage girl, 15 years old, left her family's house in the midst of her parents having a big knockdown, drag out verbal argument that she had been through many of. And it was very disturbing to her. She left her house. She went outside to get away from it. And there was a ladder that went up to the roof of her house because her father had been working on the roof. She could still hear her parents fighting through the wall or the window. So she climbed up the ladder and got on the roof, and she thought she would just sit there and wait until her parents stopped fighting. And then she noticed the antenna on top of the roof, and she went over to the antenna and stood there and grabbed hold of it with one hand and started swinging around the antenna on the top of their house, which was really a dangerous thing to do. At that point, neighbors saw her through their window, called the police. The police quickly came and brought her down from the house and brought her to the hospital. And in the hospital, she was interviewed by yours truly. So I met with her and went over the story of what happened. And there was the valid and the invalid. And finding the difference between those was really important with intervening with her. What was valid? I said to her, it makes complete sense you wanted to get away from your parents. That's very troubling, very disturbing. I get it. And you were scared and you were distancing yourself. That made sense. Going up the ladder continues to make sense. I understand that. I mean, that gets you further away from it, maybe even elevates you to the roof, and maybe you're up above the argument and you don't even hear it. And you're kind of like you can sort of find a calm place by being there instead of, let's say, running away to another town or the woods or something like that. So that's understandable. I don't fully understand why you walked over to the antenna. And she said, well, I could sort of still hear my parents. And so I went over to the antenna because I thought, here I'm on top of the world now. And I went around and around and I was singing. And when I was singing something I loved, which was all of the music from the Broadway play, A West Side Story. And she knew all the lyrics. And she's singing up on the roof and obliterating the thought of her parents. Though I must say, of interest to me with my psychoanalytic background, was that she was singing songs that came from a play about a war between two groups, fights, dangerous fights. But I didn't attribute too much to that. But I thought that was just interesting. But so at a certain, so I said, so it made sense you left the house. It made sense you went up on the roof. In a certain way, it makes sense that you went to the antenna, even though I don't like that you did that. But let me tell you about going to that antenna and swinging around like that. Never, ever, ever, ever do that again. Do you hear me? Like that's not okay. So what I was doing in the language that I'm talking to you about right now was I was validating the valid, the various emotions and thoughts and decisions that she made. But then I was invalidating the invalid, the decision to swing around on that antenna. What's interesting, she shared one more thing about it. She said, well, there is one more good thing that happened by doing that. I said, what's that? Well, now I'm in the hospital. My parents probably have to be in a meeting with a therapist. I said, that's interesting. Is that was that motivating you? Or she said, no, not at the time, but I realize now that, yeah, maybe my parents need help. I said, and that's valid too. No wonder you feel like they need help. Maybe there could have been a more skillful and less dangerous way to get them help. And I would have been willing to talk with you about that, or somebody could talk with you about that. So sorting out in a messy situation, in a dangerous situation, in a dysfunctional situation, what's valid and what's invalid turns out to be very important. If you just mix them up and you have one big gamish, one big soup made up of valid elements and invalid elements, it's really hard to know what to do about that. I mean, you don't want to invalidate the whole thing. I mean, I don't want to invalidate the whole Trump administration in this respect. I mean, I want to invalidate the invalid things they're doing. But the invalid things they're doing, I have to assume, at least in some of the cases, arise out of valid concerns that we all could share, and that there may be more, there are more cooperative and effective ways to approach. So, what's valid, for instance, just a couple of instances that occur to me. One thing that would be valid is Yeah, anytime you have an entity like a country or an organization or even a family or even a dyad, any interpersonal entity, there's a boundary around it. And that boundary sometimes needs to be managed and managed effectively. You can't just um, have that entity exist and do its thing unless there's also some protection from the outside world and from the intrusions that come from the outside world, and even if those intrusions are understandable. So having a better immigration policy is a valid concern. Being concerned about who's coming into the country and what they're bringing into the country is a valid concern. Uh, and if you stay focused on the valid concerns and try to come up solutions to them, it won't look like what's happening. Instead, what's happening is uh, the attempt to address these problems, but frame them as part of a tyrant's decision to accumulate more power and to dominate and to take over and aggrandize himself and his administration and demonstrate that nobody can stop them. Um, so then it becomes that part becomes invalid. You know, it's valid to how you deal with people in the country that are committing crimes. Obviously, that's going on. In fact, the crime rate had been going down during the Biden administration, for instance. Um, and that it's always an issue. Dealing with trying to reduce fraud and waste and abuse in any large entity like the government is a good idea. That's valid, constantly valid. It's natural for something as big as the United States government to gradually have abusiveness go on and corruption go on and fraud go on and waste going on. You just always want to be working on that. So that's a valid concern. But to handle it by all of a sudden bringing in an entity like Doge, run by somebody who wasn't elected and wasn't really appointed even by anybody other than coming in as the president's billionaire buddy. Um, it might not be a bad idea to bring in Doge even if it was done in a way that really was more cooperative and more effective. But instead, it rings like all of the other things that have been done as this kind of like empirical, imperious, tyrannical overreach all over the place like this. So there's the valid and the invalid. And once I sort of was sorting that out for myself, again, helped by my mindfulness practices in the morning when things got clearer to me, and I thought, oh, there's the valid and there's the invalid. I don't have to worry about that. I have to validate everything the Trump administration's doing and validate what I'm doing. I mean, that seems like a dialectical viewpoint, but no, you just have to validate what's valid. And then you invalidate what's invalid. And sometimes what's invalid is really bad. Like when somebody wants to die, somebody wants to kill someone else, somebody wants to ruin their life or ruin their family's life. Sometimes these things are really bad. And so you invalidate them forcefully. You stop it. You don't let it happen. You talk against it. You set up rules against it. You have penalties and punishments for it. And so, unfortunately, the way it's working now, there's so many things being done with this kind of tyrannical overreach that are this kind of like invalidation by virtue of tyrannical overreach in this area, this area, this area, this area, this area, this area. So there's one larger problem here that isn't just in any one of the areas, and the larger problem seems to be that the invalidating features of these different situations are driven by the same thing. They're driven by the desire to have unquestionable power, to be the only leader of the government rather than have a tripartite government with checks and balances. And it's happening whether you're deciding to deport people to El Salvador or whether you're deciding to impose tariffs or you're deciding, what gender can go on a passport, and all of these decisions and what whether Harvard can admit international students and all these things are just like hundreds of these things already that all smack of the same core problem the same core problem is that this administration, while I can't diagnose the individuals in it because I don't know them personally, the qualities, the characteristics of this administration, especially when it comes to the invalid features of their behavior and their overreach, all line up with the same things you see in narcissistic personality disorder of a grandiose type, where internal insecurities and internal confusion are kind of like covered over by an external shell of grandiosity and self-aggrandizement. I'm the smartest. I'm the best. No one's ever done this like me. I'm going to line myself up with the most wealthy people in the universe, and we're going to take over. And that's a sort of a grandiosity of narcissism and a trashing of those who would question you. That's another characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder, this kind of devaluation. It's an idealization of yourself. It's an idealization of the people who worship you. And it's a devaluation of those people who question you, insult you, make jokes about you. It's sort of like those aren't just taken lightly. Those are taken as that in order to assert my power and my unstoppability, I need to let you know you cannot laugh at my expense. Saturday Night Live should be off the air. Anybody who questions me on 60 Minutes or any of the news media, it should be gone. Anybody from the Associated Press that asks me a question about what I'm doing that implies that I might be doing something wrong, get them out of the White House briefing room and put other restrictions on them. These kind of overreaches are all coming from this sort of a need to assert power, to aggrandize self, and to devalue anything that questions that. And then that leads to these fights. There's also often a quality with narcissism that is on the edge of, if not entirely in the camp of paranoia, the feeling that you're being victimized. And if we've heard it from Donald Trump, we've heard it a million times. The way in which he feels that he's not being appreciated, he's not being recognized, he's being victimized, that the world is guilty of what he calls Trump derangement syndrome. These are anti-Trumpers. Everybody who has a question about his functioning is an anti-Trumper. There's a way in which he lines up the world that's a lot like a person with a narcissistic disorder who looks around, and if people don't embrace and endorse and approve and reinforce him or her, they are questionable and they might be dangerous to him. So he has to eliminate them. So there's this kind of paranoia. There's also another quality that often goes along with narcissism. Some people have it, some people don't, which is the tendency towards lying and stealing and cheating in order to go along with your self-aggrandizement. Is that the reports of Donald Trump in golf, for instance, even though it sounds like he's a good golfer, are that he, overtly cheats or overtly says he wins tournaments even if he didn't participate in part of the tournament. And it's a tournament in a golf club that he owns. So he has control over everybody. So there's a kind of like a not playing by the rules, a not feeling like your rules apply to you, that you can do what you want, and people have to go along with that. And so you reshape the rules as your own rules imposed on the universe. You have to do this. And otherwise, you are attacking those who are not playing by your rules. But what's happening now, of course, is there's a massive developing war between Donald Trump administration rules, which have been signed on to by many people, surprisingly, that you would not have guessed a few years ago they would have signed on to. But everybody's a little vulnerable to wanting power and wanting to be with the powerful. The sort of magnetism of being around power and getting power from being around power. So there is this kind of buying into a narcissistic organizational entity. Now, there are people who know much more about thinking about organizations than I do, so I'm going to just leave it there. And I'm also going to come back in a next podcast or two about just some sort of practical suggestions of taking care of yourself or taking action as all of this continues to evolve. It's clearly not going away today or tomorrow. In fact, in a few minutes, I'm going down to a sort of a nonviolent, just local protest to speak out. And the fact that I understand that I can try to discern what's valid and invalid, what I want to fight against, which is the invalid parts, which seem to come from the narcissism, you know, the empowers me. Now I know what I can do, and I don't have to do everything. So thank you everybody for listening. If you want to give me feedback about this podcast, you could do it through my website, charlieswenson.com, which has all of my other podcasts from the past, which go back to 2017, all the different kinds of hell that I've talked about. And if you want to write me feedback about this particular podcast, you could write through that website, has a way to send me an email, or you can send me directly an email at my email address, which is c.robert, C, the letter C, robert.swenson@gmail.com. I hope you found this useful, and have a good week. Bye-bye.